The honourable member for Regina, Lewvan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In June, I asked whether the government would consider sanctioning President Trump's personal business interests in order to lift the American tariffs from our steel and aluminum exports. I'd like to begin by mentioning the high cost of these tariffs to our country. Not only have they reduced current exports and cost jobs in the present, they are also deterring investment into Canada's steel and aluminum industries, which of course is costing our economy and employment in the long term as well. So, Mr. Speaker, what has the government done so far? Well, it's applied reciprocal tariffs to American steel and aluminum coming into our country. It also had retaliatory tariffs that were targeted on products coming from politically sensitive American electoral districts. And Mr. Speaker, while that was a very clever type of retaliation, I really think that it's run its course, given that we had the American midterm elections yesterday, whatever political consequences have been felt, and unfortunately the U.S. steel and aluminum tariffs are still applying to Canadian exports. So we need to look at other options, and as I suggested back in June, one of those options could be to sanction the personal business interests of President Trump. Unlike previous American presidents, he has not divested his business assets. And Mr. Speaker, this makes him uniquely vulnerable to the possibility of sanctions from other countries. So I'd like to hear what the government's response is to that option. I think another option that we need to look at involves the recently agreed to USMCA agreement. Just this evening, CBC reported that our ambassador to the United States has indicated that the Prime Minister will not participate in a signing ceremony as long as the American steel and aluminum tariffs remain in place. However, it does seem that the government is prepared to go ahead and sign the agreement. CNN interviewed the Prime Minister and he said, quote, "We're not at the point of saying that we wouldn't sign if it wasn't lifted, although we're trying to make that case." End quote. So, Mr. Speaker, it sounds as though the government is prepared to go ahead and sign USMCA even if American tariffs continue to apply to Canadian steel and aluminum exports. And I think that that's a big problem. I think one of the obvious goals of a free trade agreement should be not to have that type of tariff in place between our two countries. So I do find it concerning that the government is already signaling by way of this interview that the Prime Minister did on CNN that they're prepared to go ahead and sign USMCA even if the U.S. keeps these tariffs in place. I think we need our government to take a much stronger stand on that point, and we really need to see some strong action to get these American tariffs off our steel and aluminum exports. So, Mr. Speaker, to sum up, we have these American tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum being sold south of the border. It's imposing huge costs on Canada's economy and on Canadian workers. My constituents and other Canadians need to know what the government's plan is and what the government's timeline will be to have these American tariffs removed. Thanks very much.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Health.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank the honourable member from Regina, Lewvan, for his question. Mr. Speaker, last month we reached consensus with the U.S. alongside Mexico on a new modernized North American free trade agreement for the 21st century. Our government fought hard to reach a good agreement, and we were successful. The ties across North America are essential for our shared economic prosperity, and we look forward to further deepening our close economic ties with the U.S. and Mexico. On the question of U.S. Section 232 tariffs, our position remains unchanged. The U.S. tariffs imposed under the rationale of national security on steel and aluminum are unacceptable and an affront to the long-standing security partnership between the U.S. and Canada. These tariffs are illegitimate and unjustified, and that is a message that we have repeatedly shared with the U.S. administration. It is overwhelmingly in the best interest of both Canada and the United States for these reciprocal tariffs to be lifted. In the meantime, we've taken strong, responsive measures to defend our steel and aluminum workers, and that is why we responded earlier in July by imposing tariffs against U.S. imports worth $16.6 billion, equivalent to the value of Canadian steel and aluminum trade affected. This is the largest trade action Canada has taken since World War II. Our government has also announced that it's making available up to $2 billion to defend and protect the interests of Canadian workers and businesses in the steel, aluminum, and manufacturing industries. These measures are helping to strengthen the competitiveness of Canada's steel and aluminum companies and contribute to economic growth while increasing the capacity of the industries to innovate, grow value added, support product and market diversification, and create and sustain jobs for Canadians. As we have always said, the NAFTA talks are completely separate from these illegal Section 232 tariffs. However, now that we've completed the USMCA, we now have some wind in our sails, and we continue to work for the permanent removal of the U.S. tariffs. In the meantime, our reciprocal countermeasures will remain in place until the tariffs are removed, and we are challenging the U.S. tariffs under the World Trade Organization and NAFTA rules. All Canadians can rest assured that the removal of the Section 232 tariffs is a priority for our government. Thank you very much.
Honourable Member for Regina, Lewvan.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I certainly appreciate that the Parliamentary Secretary has stated the government's opposition to the illegitimate American tariffs on our steel and aluminum exports. I think everyone in this House shares the goal of removing those tariffs. The question we're debating this evening is how to achieve that goal. The Parliamentary Secretary mentioned the government's existing retaliatory strategy, which was largely based on targeting certain American electoral districts. Now that the U.S. midterm elections are over, I wonder whether the Parliamentary Secretary believes that that strategy has worked, or whether he would agree with me that some new strategy is now required. I would like to hear some kind of a response to the possibility of instead targeting President Trump's personal business interests rather than continuing for retaliation that targets the American people in a sense. And I'd also like a commitment that the government won't sign USMCA until these tariffs are lifted.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, our government will always stand up for Canadian workers, businesses, and consumers. The recently agreed USMCA is proof of that. It safeguards more than $2 billion a day in cross-border trade and tariff-free access for more than 70% of Canadian exports. In fact, with CETA and CPTPP, the USMCA means Canada now has tariff-free access to 1.5 billion consumers around the world. That's great news for our businesses and workers, and just as we fought for Canadians at the NAFTA negotiating table, we will fight for them to remove these unfair U.S. tariffs. Thank you.